Okay, I'd like to continue our discussion of agreeableness, and we were discussing the downsides of agreeableness. It's not all positive. And I mentioned the fact that people who are high in agreeableness are easily exploited by other people. And I mentioned the fact that they tend to get paid less for the same work because they fail to negotiate for themselves. There's another important point that I want to make because there's often a lot of misunderstanding about this. And that is, being high in agreeableness is not always associated with being morally right or being emotionally healthy. And as I said, there's often a lot of confusion about this, and in some ways I may have inadvertently contributed to it last time in sort of kind of jokingly referring to these people as saintly. So I definitely want to correct that. We should be very careful not to equate the trait of agreeableness with any kind of moral superiority, because that's certainly not the case, because that's not what's motivating the behavior. And it's possible to be high and to not be high in agreeableness and still be very moral. And again, and it's also possible to be high in agreeableness and be, engage in pretty undesirable behavior. So the two are not equivalent. And to make that point, consider that highly agreeable people in the Old South would have gone right along with racial injustice against blacks. And if you go back, and I'm talking about in the early 20th century, and if you'd gone back another 50 plus years, they would have supported slavery because that's what the people around them believed. And it's very important for these people to fit in. And so, if they were in the South, at that time, they would have gone right along with that kind of racial injustice. Similarly, Germans would have gone right along with the mistreatment of Jews under the Nazi regime. People who are high in agreeableness aren't the ones who are going to stand up to that. They're the last people in some ways who are going to stand up to that. Their motive is to fit in, to be in harmony with those around them. So if those around them are engaged in behavior which we might consider immoral, they're going to go along with it most of the time. Okay, so we shouldn't confuse that tendency to get along. Again, that's their motto of life. Can't we all just get along? That's very different than trying to do the moral thing. And so, to illustrate this, I mean, Mother Teresa is widely regarded as one of the most holy and good people of the 20th century. Yet she was not afraid to stand up to anyone, including her own bishops, in pursuit of doing the right thing. And so, in that sense, she wasn't super high in agreeableness, because she wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers to do what she considered to be the right thing. And so, although most religions teach that we should live in harmony, there are times when good people have to stand up against injustice and so on, and people who are high in agreeableness are not likely to do that. Okay. They're also not likely to, so they can be, as they say, on the wrong side of history. And they're certainly not likely to make history. People who make a real difference in the world are, again, those people often suffer the slings and arrows from society. In fact, sometimes those people who really make a difference in the world they face a lot of hostility sometimes. Sometimes they have a lot of people who support them, but they're often polarizing at best, and so there are people who support them and people who don't support them. But people who really make a difference are not agreeable. Agreeable people are not leaders; they're followers. At the end of the day, even though they sometimes can fall into positions of leadership at a local or small level, they're more followers than leaders, in the sense that they're looking to other people to know how to behave. So our great presidents, for example, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, none of our great presidents were high in agreeableness. And as I said, you'd hard-pressed to find anyone of great significance in history who was high in agreeableness. So, this is the sort of, I guess the point again is it's not all positive. It's not entirely positive. So again, these are people who will willingly align themselves with harmful acts if they're socially sanctioned. And I think, this is kind of an important point, because I think people often fail to consider that a lot of bad things that happen in the world, it's not by a single evil person, it's by all the other people who go along with them. And so this is not an inconsequential point. And I'm not trying to impugn people who are high in agreeableness, but merely to point out it's not all positive, because as I alluded to last time, people tend to assume, because the word agreeableness sounds positive, and there are, in fact, a lot of positive consequences associated with this. But it's not uniformly positive. And I think that's important to understand. They're often, another negative about this trait, they're often resentful towards others. And so again, this is something that distinguishes them from the extrovert. The extrovert is truly happy and positive. They love life. They're living life and they're loving it. People who are high in agreeableness present a positive face, but they're often resentful toward other people because people are exploiting them. And at some level, now some of them are naive enough, they kind of don't totally get it, that they're being exploited, and they often have a hard time, again, accepting that. But sometimes a lot of them will end up resenting, they're doing the work and other people are benefiting from it. And some of them do have this resentfulness and even bitterness under the surface. Now, they're not likely to show it, especially to people who they're not really, really close to. but it's often there. And so there's a difference between the public self and the private self. Um, so they're not, again, the sort of veneer of perfection that they will present to the world is not necessarily how they're feeling inside. And so again, the point that's I think you should remember, their behavior is motivated primarily by an intolerance of conflict. I mean, that's the thing to understand. And that it's a level of intolerance that in some cases can be unhealthy. Conflict is part of life. We have to be able to deal with it. And in some cases, these people, I mean, the discomfort that they have for conflict can be almost pathological or unhealthy. And that's, again, what's motivating them. Nothing else. It's not about, necessarily being better human beings or anything. It's that they don't like conflict. Now, let's talk a little bit about the opposite end of this continuum. Disagreeable people, to a large extent, are opposite of the agreeable people, whereas the agreeable people are trusting to a fault. These people, on the other end, are skeptical and cynical. They don't trust people. They question other people's motives, almost to a fault. Again, we're talking about the extremes. Just as, with extroversion, we're talking about the extremes, and it is a continuum. So, and again, just as with extroversion, I'm highlighting people on the extremes, very high and very low in agreeableness. So, so these people are very skeptical. They don't trust other people. They question the motives of other people, even when it's not justified. They are egocentric and grandiose. And many of you, especially those who've taken my personality course, know what that's associated with. Egocentricity and grandiosity are hallmarks of the narcissistic personality disorder. And people who are low in agreeableness tend to be quite narcissistic. They also can be manipulative, dishonest, callous, and even aggressive. They often exhibit what we call a hostile attribution bias, which is the tendency to interpret innocent behavior on the part of other people as having hostile intent. And this comes from the first point there, the cynical. They don't trust people, and they assume that people are up to no good. And so even when people do something innocuous, like, for example, let's say someone accidentally bumps into you, or if you have a shopping cart at a grocery store and they actually tap your cart, they might perceive that as a hostile act. Benign things that almost certainly are accidents, they might attribute some hostile intent to. And that's the hostile attribution bias. And, this is a problem because when people have this, you don't want to be overly trusting, but you also don't want to be overly skeptical either, because when you do that, number one, what people who are high in, or who have this hostile attribution bias are more likely to behave, retaliate in their own mind against these people, or in some cases preemptively behave in a hostile way toward other people, and they end up hurting themselves in the process, because if when you're hostile to others, others are hostile to you, and it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy that they actually bring out the very thing that they're concerned about. By having this hostile attribution bias, other people end up responding to them in a hostile way. So, in many ways, they miss out on a lot of opportunities and bring trouble on themselves needlessly because they have this outlook. Individuals who are very low, and again, these are going to be people who are quite low in agreeableness, are more likely to be involved in crime, risky sex, drug abuse, and other antisocial behaviors. This is actually a very strong predictor of incarceration. One of the better predictors of incarceration is being very low in agreeableness. And of course, if you're low in agreeableness and conscientiousness, that's pretty much a guarantee. And in fact, the correlation between agreeableness and antisocial personality is between 0.25 and 0.4. So again, that's a pretty strong relationship. Being very low in agreeableness does not bode well, and again, especially if it's also if the person is also low in conscientiousness, which we'll talk about next time. So, and finally, as I alluded to earlier, people who are people who are low in agreeableness are more likely than people high in agreeableness to become great leaders. Again, people who are high in agreeableness might be selected to head some committee at work or something like that because people like them. But they're not likely to become, great leaders, at the national level. And we know that American presidents are less agreeable than the average American. And that's probably true of a lot of positions of power. And the great, quote unquote, presidents, such as Teddy Roosevelt, who's on Mount Rushmore, are less agreeable than other presidents. So presidents are less agreeable than the average person, but the great presidents are less agreeable than the mediocre presidents. So, again, this tells us that people who are the kind of people who are drawn to power and tend to be not highly agreeable. And, someone who's high in agreeableness is not going to be able to withstand the onslaught of negativity that comes your way when you're running for or serving as president. I mean, we've seen recently, how this works. Every president has a lot of political enemies, and they often go to great lengths to make them look bad, and so on. And so this is not the domain of people who are high in agreeableness. This, in fact, that's a nightmare for people who are high in agreeableness. And so it's the domain of people who are low in agreeableness. Okay. Well, so finally, just to kind of recap, being too far in either direction of agreeableness is maladaptive. So you can discard the idea that agreeableness is always positive. Just as we saw with extroversion, there's positive and negative in both directions. And the same is true of agreeableness, even despite how pleasant the name sounds. And so the key, once again, is to strike a balance between the two extremes. This one, perhaps even more so. The key is to strike a balance. You don't want to be really high in agreeableness, and you don't want to be really low in agreeableness. Okay, we will stop there, and we will talk about conscientiousness next time.